The tractor engine coughed twice and died. Wendell Askew climbed down anyway, boots sinking into frost-hard mud, and stood at the edge of 130 acres of dead trees. Rows of them, black-barked and bent, stretching toward a gray horizon like burnt matchsticks. A county condemnation sign hung crooked on the gate, rusted through at one corner. He didn't read it. He'd read it 100 times already. Instead, he knelt down in the frozen dirt, pushed his bare fingers into the soil, and smelled it. Then he smiled, like a man who'd just been told good news nobody else could hear. By that afternoon, 3 trucks had backed up to the old barn, hauling in things no orchard should ever need: busted beehives, sacks of spent mushroom compost, buckets of fish heads from the ice plant down in Hazlitt Ford. Wendell dug trenches between the dead rows and buried the fish whole, wrapping each one in wet burlap like he was laying something to rest. His daughter Junie watched from the fence rail, nose wrinkled at the smell. "Daddy," she said, "why are you burying garbage under dead trees?" Wendell didn't answer. He just kept digging, humming something low, like the ground itself was listening. If a story like this one has ever made you slow down and breathe a little easier, consider hitting subscribe. It helps this channel more than you'd guess. And I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight, so drop it in the comments below. Now, back to Coy County, Arkansas, and the man everybody there had already decided was throwing his family's last dollar into a hole in the ground. Coy County sits in the flat river bottom of eastern Arkansas, where the soil turns to gumbo after rain, and the towns are named for men nobody remembers anymore. Hazlitt Ford was one such town, population 800 and shrinking, a feed store, a Baptist church with a leaning steeple, and a diner that still took checks. The Bell Fork Orchard had once fed half the county with peaches and pecans, back before a blight and 2 bad owners ran it into the ground. The county condemned it in the spring of that year, boarded the farmhouse, and let the land sit like a wound nobody wanted to touch. Wendell Askew had worked the grain elevator in town for 11 years before it closed. His wife, Cressida, took in mending to keep the lights on, her sewing machine humming late into the night at the kitchen table while Junie did homework by the same lamp. It was Cressida who first heard about the county's land redemption program: buy the condemned orchard for back taxes, sign a contract promising to restore it to working production within 24 months, or lose it to auction and the developer already circling. She read the contract twice, then set it in front of Wendell without a word. He read it once. Then he asked where the checkbook was. The neighbors heard within a week. Everyone in Hazlitt Ford heard everything within a week. Odell Farah, who farmed the land bordering Bell Fork and had wanted it cheap for hay ground, came by just to shake his head over the fence. "Wendell, that orchard's been dead longer than my truck's been paid off. You're gonna bury your family's whole savings under a bunch of rotten stumps." Wendell just kept unloading wood chips from his flatbed. "Trees ain't dead, Odell," he said. "They're just starved." Odell laughed all the way back to his own truck, loud enough for the whole road to hear. That night, Cressida sat on the porch step and watched Wendell walk the dark rows with a lantern, checking his buried trenches like a man checking on sleeping children. She thought of her own father, a sharecropper who used to say dirt was the only bank that never lied to you. She hadn't believed him as a girl. Watching her husband now, kneeling in soil that smelled of rot and fish and rain, she wondered if maybe he had. She didn't say any of this to Wendell. She just brought him coffee and sat with him until the lantern burned low. Spring came and Wendell didn't plant new trees. Not tidy nursery stock in even rows like anyone would expect. Instead, he grafted strange little whips onto the old rootstock, bent, wild-looking cuttings he'd traded for from an old-timer 3 counties over, varieties nobody in Coy County had ever heard of. He let the grass grow tall between the rows instead of mowing it bare. He hauled in more chips, more compost, more fish, until the whole orchard smelled like low tide mixed with a compost heap. Town folks driving past on Route 9 slowed down just to stare and shake their heads at the mess of it. Thurman Boyle, the county land agent who'd drawn up the redemption contract, drove out in June to check progress. He walked the rows in his good shoes, wrinkling his nose at the smell, making notes on a clipboard. "Mr. Askew," he said, not unkindly, "I need to see production, fruit, something a grocer would buy. Right now I'm seeing weeds and dead wood." Wendell nodded slow. "Give it time, Thurman." Thurman tapped his clipboard. "Contract gives you till September, 2 years out. Time's the one thing I can't give you more of." He got back in his car and drove off, leaving tire tracks in the mud. By the first winter, some of the grafts had taken. Small green buds pushed through bark that had looked dead as driftwood. Wendell walked the rows each morning before sunup, breath fogging, running his thumb over every swelling bud like he was reading Braille. Junie started following him some mornings, notebook in hand, writing down which trees looked strongest. "That one's my favorite," she said, pointing to a gnarled old pecan that had somehow survived the blight years. Wendell smiled. "That one remembers how good it can be. Just needed somebody to believe it before it believed itself." Then came the setback. A dry spell hit in July, the worst in a decade, and half the compost Wendell had counted on delivering nitrogen through the summer dried to dust before it could break down. The new grafts, stressed and thirsty, began dropping their leaves early. Wendell stood in the rows one evening, watching leaves curl and fall like the trees were giving up on him. Cressida found him sitting on an overturned bucket in the dark, head in his hands. "Maybe Odell's right," he said quietly. "Maybe I bought a graveyard and called it a garden." Cressida didn't argue with him. She just handed him a jar of well water and sat down on the bucket beside him. "You didn't buy dead land, Wendell. You bought tired land. There's a difference, and you know it better than anybody in this county." He looked at her a long moment, then out at the rows of stressed trees under the rising moon. The next morning he was back before dawn, running irrigation lines by hand from the old well, hauling buckets until his shoulders ached, refusing to let one more tree go without a fight it hadn't asked to lose. The second year turned the corner. Rain came back in the spring, gentle and steady. And the wild grass between the rows grew thick and green, holding moisture the bare orchard rows next door couldn't. Wendell noticed something he hadn't expected. His rows stayed cooler in the heat, damper after dry spells, alive with bees from the old broken hives he'd scattered as shelter. Blossoms came heavier that spring than anyone in Hazlitt Ford remembered from Bell Fork's best years. Odell drove past twice that week, slower each time, saying nothing at all, which for Odell was its own kind of loud confession. But the contract deadline hadn't moved. September was 6 weeks off, and Thurman Boyle scheduled his final inspection for the last week of the month, the day that would decide whether Bell Fork Orchard stayed in the Askew family or went to auction, developer bulldozers already penciled in for October. Wendell walked the rows counting blossoms turned to green fruit, doing arithmetic in his head that never quite added up to certainty. "We're close," he told Cressida one night. But close ain't the same as done, and Thurman don't grade on close. 3 nights before the inspection, the radio in the Askew kitchen crackled with a warning nobody in Coy County wanted to hear in late September: an unseasonable Arctic front, temperatures dropping into the 20s, a hard frost expected across the whole river bottom by morning. Cressida gripped the counter. Wendell just grabbed his coat off the hook and walked straight out into the dark toward the orchard, lantern swinging, already running numbers on which trees might survive and which wouldn't, knowing full well that whatever happened in those next few hours would answer the question 2 years of labor had been building toward. Every orchard and row crop in Coy County took the frost that night, hard, biting, killing. By morning, Odell's hay ground was silvered white and limp. The Simmons peach trees 2 farms over lost their whole late crop overnight, branches drooping black by noon. Farmers up and down Route 9 walked their fields in the gray dawn light, breath fogging, surveying damage that would cost them thousands. Word moved fast down every gravel road that morning. The kind of morning that decides a season, maybe a year, maybe more, for every grower unlucky enough to be caught without shelter. Thurman Boyle arrived at Bell Fork at 9 that morning expecting the worst, clipboard tucked under his arm, already composing in his mind the letter that would end the Askew contract. He got out of his car at the gate and stopped cold. The tall grass between the rows stood frosted but whole. The dense cover, the windbreak of scattered brush piles, the sheltering hum of bees waking slow in their scattered hives, all of it had done something the bare, tidy orchards down the road hadn't managed. He walked the first row in silence, running his hand along a branch heavy with unbothered green fruit. Word of what Thurman found spread through Hazlitt Ford before lunch, carried mostly by his own stunned retelling at the diner counter. By afternoon, half the county had driven out to see it themselves. Trucks parked 3 deep along the fence line, farmers walking the rows Odell had once called a graveyard, running their hands over fruit that should not, by any normal measure, have survived a night like that one. Odell Farrow stood at the end of a row for a long while, saying nothing before finally reaching up, picking a single unmarked peach, and biting into it right there in front of everybody. Thurman signed off on the contract that same week, nodding in his final report that Bell Fork Orchard had exceeded every production benchmark required, the only orchard in Coy County that had. The developer's bulldozers never came. Instead, by the following spring, 3 neighboring farmers had asked Wendell, quietly and without much pride left to spare, how exactly a man grew grass, fish, and old broken beehives into an orchard that could outlast a killing frost. Wendell told each of them the same thing, standing in the same rows where Odell had once laughed at him. Ground remembers kindness, he said, same as people do. The Askew family kept Bell Fork Orchard, and 2 summers later it fed the county again, same as it had a generation before Wendell was born. Junie still walks the rows some mornings with her notebook, though it's mostly full now, pages soft from handling. Cressida sells jars of peach preserves at the Hazlitt Ford diner counter, and folks driving Route 9 in late September slow down now not to stare in pity, but just to look at rows of green and gold standing steady while frost silvers the fields all around them. Some kindnesses, it turns out, take root exactly where the ground was given up for dead.